Like I said, what happened to Belfast basically is pretty much, well, it has to do with things like the honey ship, the Japanese-Chinese ship. Basically, the blacks or the browns were running around and basically stealing and killing. They took out the honey ship, the Japanese-Chinese honey ship, and they took out a whole bunch of other things, along with some Yankees. And like I said, they moved into Belfast and they tortured and killed the German person, the German manager that I had working there. And then basically they took it over, pretty much. You know, as the African Black Race War, pretty much between 1800 and 1900, pretty much there was this huge race war. You know, they moved into Belfast and they basically took over the Belfast shipyard, and then they took over the French shipyard. And they basically just killed the managers and the workers there, and basically took it over. And for a while there, Belfast was like black haven, black and brown haven. They were the only ones with money, and everyone else was like chained to the ground and chained to the streets. And you know, basically they pretty much enslaved everyone, and pretty much they were whipping and torturing everyone, and cutting off their male parts, their tubes. Anyway, a lot of people would call it the Great Depression, but basically it was the black-white. It was a black and brown takeover of everything. And what happened, like I said, they moved into Belfast and they would just kill whoever, you know, run through the streets and gun. And it had been a thriving community of like a couple 100,000 or million. And then the black people were just like, you know, decent people shouldn't live here, blah, blah, blah. And unless you were black, you know, you got shot pretty much. The blacks were running around with bulletproof vests and guns and basically, you know, just pretty much taking over the whole town, the whole place. They forced labor, built a whole bunch of buildings and moved a whole bunch of black families in there and gave them all nice and clothes, and basically were giving them everything and making everyone basically forced labor, you know. And it was basically the black and brown take over, and they destroyed the whole place practically and burned it. You know, it wasn't necessarily, a lot of those cities, they weren't bombed. It was just the black people. They just moved in and just burned it. You know, they do the same thing in America. You know, they just move into a community, and black and brown prided himself on it. He was like, we are like the plague. You know, when brown's in town, someone's going down. You know, and all that kind of stuff. And basically he was like that. And pretty much he took down Belfast and a whole bunch of other cities, basically. And that's what happened. You know, they started spraying graffiti. They started stealing. You know, there had been a lot of gold there and a lot of stuff. So they just moved in and basically started stealing everything and then melting it down for gold, just like the Republicans. And the Republicans were probably in with them. They called themselves aristocrats and all that other stuff. Anyway, it wasn't Irish. It wasn't Germans. It wasn't anything like that. It wasn't French. It was a bunch of blacks and a bunch of Yankees, a couple whites, you know, like a couple thousand whites and all that. And that's what happened to Belfast, pretty much. And it took it years. I mean, the Irish finally had to put their foot down and basically say that's enough, and basically rebuild their city and their town. You know, they weren't going to stand for it. You know, and they did this whole thing of like the Arab community, and it was like the black Arabs. It's like, there are no black Arabs. You know, like, there are no black Arabs. You know, I mean, so it's just the blacks being like, all right, well, and then they were stating tribal right to rape and tribal right to kill, and saying that was their right, and like, no. Anyway, so the Irish had to kick them all out of Belfast, pretty much. And, you know, so they moved on to the next town, pretty much. Like I said, Mr. Brown, he prided himself on taking down everything and everyone. He prided himself on destruction and the fact that his people were like a plague. Like, they'd come into town, they'd just start stealing and robbing, and basically, you know, they would start a riot right away and just run through the streets and steal all the clothes and stuff and then run off into the woods. Anyway, he prided himself on it. So, you know, that's why I'm to Belfast. They took over the Belfast shipyard and sold off every scrap of metal they could possibly get and made knives out of it. You know, as many knives as they could. They made swords and stuff and tried to take over the rest of the world or just go out like a plague, and they had to fight them off. Anyway, the French, they took over the Belfast shipyard, and then they were moving up into the French shipyard, and the French started fighting them. They resisted. They're like, no, you're not. And the Irish went up to the French shipyard, and we kind of like pushed them out that way, and then they kind of regrouped and came back around, you know. Anyway, it's just a black and brown takeover or whatever. You know, Mr. Brown, Mr. Black, Papa. Anyway, it's just them. So that was the problem, is that, you know, he was purposely trying to take down civilization. Made it his mission. So anyway, that's why the place got destroyed and everything else. You know, it had been a thriving community until they moved in there. And then he purposely, like, basically moved in there like a plague. He loved to talk about it too. He loved to say, "My people are like a plague. We'll take you down." Anyway, yeah. So that's what happened. So it wasn't really a war. You know, it wasn't really like World War or anything like that. It was just the black people. Anyway, they hit the honey ship. They hit a bunch of things. You know, they basically, you know, anybody with money, anybody with power, anybody with anything, if you had a better gun or whatever, they would just, you know, find you and kill you, torture you, and take everything you had. That's what the blacks did. So anyway, didn't work out for them like they say. But if anyone wants to know why everything got destroyed and what all those pictures are about, it was the black people. You know, they weren't slaves. They had never worked a day in their life. They just had a gun or a sword, you know, and they were just using steroids. They weren't even all that tough. They couldn't do anything until they got the steroids, and then they started taking over because they were finally stronger. Anyway, yeah. So till then they were just normal like everyone else, and then they got the steroids, and then they were like, oh, you know, and then they started making a mess, you know, and then doing this, whoo, it's so fast and so smart, and they were just on steroids, you know, and maybe it's male aggression of the horse steroids that they were taking. I don't really know, but they were just psychotic. Anyway, so they destroyed Belfast and a bunch of other cities, and I guess they're destroying America. You know, I mean. Anyway, though, yeah, though, so if anyone wants to know why and what happened, you know, they were just raping and killing and going through the world like a plague. And, you know, Mr. Brown, that Papa, that's what he wanted, that's what he liked. He always would get on the radio and say, "My people are like a plague," you know, and all this and that. Anyway, yeah, and he would say, "Oh, they killed my son, we have to get him," and like, nobody killed his son. Well, eventually they did. But, I mean, well, his son got killed. He took on a woman. Like I say, it's the funniest thing. He took on a woman, and she won. She killed him. So, anyway, I think jabbed him or something, I don't know. Like there's a lot of Black Death, basically. I mean, they lost hundreds of thousands of people, basically, because they were just trying to rape and kill, and, you know, people had to defend themselves, so, and they did, so. And their only advantage really is that they would hit a house with like 30 of them. So like 30 of them would go to a house to go and attack it, and there's only like 10 people there, and mostly children. So they would just attack in groups of 100 or 300 people, of 300 blacks, you know, and they would just overwhelm the fence or the farmer, you know, and then they would rape the women, and then they would move off after they took everything of value. So, yeah, and that's what Papa wanted. That's what Black and Mr. Brown, Mr. Harlem and Wolf, you know, that's what they wanted. So anyway, that's the way they were leading their people. Anyway,